Welcome to Math 99, Week 6. We're continuing with factoring. So I hope you practiced the first two strategies that we talked about in the last week's lectures. The first strategy we used was finding a greatest common factor to write our polynomial as a product. The second strategy was to factor by grouping. And we said we usually use that when we had 4 terms in our polynomial. Today we want to look at factoring quadratic trinomials. It's actually going to be a fairly short lesson this week. My hope is that rather than spending time listening to me, you're going to spend a lot of time practicing. Remember that you do have quizzes due this week. Make sure you complete them on time. And I believe you have a test coming up, maybe next week. Check your schedule in the course outline for those dates. So a quadratic trinomial, the type that we're going to be looking at, is in this form ax squared plus bx plus c. A, b, and c all represent real numbers. And we're going to say, because we're talking about a quadratic trinomial here, that we don't want a to equal 0. If a equals 0, we won't have a quadratic. Now let's do a quick review of multiplying binomials to start. So here's an example, 2x plus 3 times x minus 5. So we have the first term multiplying the second bracket, and the second term multiplying the second bracket. Of course, we use the distributive property then. And then we combine any like terms. So what I want you to pay attention to is the relationship between our quadratic trinomial, the product, and the multiplication that gave us this product. Let's look at the last term here. Negative 15. We got that negative 15 by multiplying the last two terms, 3 times negative 5. Let's look at the first term. We got this 2x squared by multiplying the first terms here, 2x times x. The middle term came from multiplying the outside and the inside. When we multiplied negative 5 times 2, that gave us negative 10. When we multiplied the 3 times x, it gave us the plus 3. So we want to be able to work backwards now when we're factoring. We're going to start with the trinomial and try to determine what we multiplied to get there. We already know the factorization for this trinomial. We just multiplied it here. But let's see if we can work backwards and get there. The first thing I want you to do is find a, b, and c, and a times c. So remember, this is in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. I see in my example, a equals 2, b equals negative 7, c equals negative 15, and a times c is negative 30. A times c, 2 times negative 15 is negative 30. Now we had those sums and products worksheets that we talked about last week. I hope you've been practicing those. We're going to use that idea of sums and products now when we factor quadratic trinomials. So here we're looking for two numbers that have a product of a times c. a product of negative 30, and two numbers that have a sum of b, negative 7. Now you remember from practicing that we said that if you don't know the numbers right off, you always want to list the factors for your product. We list our factors in pairs. And hopefully we see that two of those numbers, when adding or subtracting, give us 7. We know that 3 times 10 is 30, and 10 minus 3 will give us 7. But how do we get a negative 30 and a negative 7? I need the 10 to be negative. The key is that you want the same numbers in both of these questions. If you don't know how to do this, you need to go back to last week's lectures and the worksheets that I've posted in the class Moodle page and practice these, because without this, it's going to be very difficult to factor. We're going to use the two numbers we found to rewrite the term in the middle. We're going to rewrite negative 7x. We're going to use the 3 and the negative 10. Plus 3x minus 10x gives us negative 7x. Keep the 2x squared. Keep the negative 15. So all of this is still equal to our trinomial. We just took negative 7x and rewrote it as 3x minus 10x. Now this should look familiar to you. We have 4 terms. Now we can factor by grouping. I hope you've been practicing factoring by grouping. I see that x is common in the first 2 terms. When I look at the last 2 terms, I see that 5 is common. But because there's a negative sign here, I know that I want a factor of negative 5. Negative 10x divided by 5 is 2x. Negative 15 divided by negative 5 is plus 3. 2x plus 3 is common. And we have a remaining quotient of x minus 5. Remember that when you are finished, you will have a product. We have the multiplication of 2 factors here, 2x plus 3 multiplying x minus 5. In Math 99, the biggest thing every single one of you needs is practice. And we can check our answers by multiplying. We already know that 2x plus 3 times x minus 5 equals 2x squared minus 7x minus 15. We have that up here. Notice that these steps backwards are exactly what we've done to do our factorization. Here's the 2x squared, the minus 10x, the plus 3x, and the minus 15, just like it was there when we were multiplying. The order of these numbers, the 10 and the 3, that doesn't matter. If you wrote negative 10x first and then plus 3x, that's fine. It's going to work out. Now here are some questions for practicing on paper. If you need to watch another example or two, keep watching. Otherwise, pause the video, work on these questions, and then come back and check. So here's my paper. I hope you have new paper in front of you. Please don't try to squish this into the margins, into places that are too tiny and too tight to work. You need lots of room. Math requires paper and space. So step 1 says we wanted to find A, B, and C. A is 1, 1x squared. B is -3, and C is -18. Remember, we want two numbers that multiply to A times C and add to equal B. Well, B is -3. A times C, -18. Remember, if you don't know those numbers quickly and easily, you want to list the factors for our product. We always list the factors in pairs. We're trying to find two numbers now that will add or subtract to equal 3. We want the same numbers in both places. I want it to multiply to -18 and add to -3. 6 will need to be negative. It doesn't matter the order you write those numbers in. We're going to use those numbers to rewrite the middle term. Keep x squared, and now, instead of writing -3x, we have -6x plus 3x. They add to equal -3x, and keep the -18. Now we factor by grouping. X is common in the first two terms. 3 is common in the last two terms. Keep that x. And then divide. X squared divided by x. -6x divided by x. Remember, this is a +3. You need to have a sign there. 3x divided by 3, -18 divided by 3. X minus 6 is common. And we have the factor x plus 3 left. Let's check our factorization for question 1. I'm not going to do this for every question. It will just take too long, but we can check this one. If you are going to check on your test or your final exam, make sure you tell me that you're checking. Remember, we're going to multiply this out to ensure that it gives us the trinomial we started with. So we have x times the second bracket minus 6 times the second bracket. Oops, that was supposed to be an x plus 3 there. Okay, the trinomial I got when I multiplied is the same as the trinomial I started with. We know we're good. If you're ready to try a question on your own, you can pause the video and try this one. Otherwise, watch another example. We want A, B, and C. A is 3, B is -5, C is 2. We want two numbers with a product of A times C and a sum of B. A times C is 6, B is -5. Now, lots of times people put in 1 times 6, 1 times 6, and then they find out, well, 6 would need to be negative here, but if I put a negative here, it doesn't work. 1 times -6 does not equal +6. So I can't use those numbers. So you might have to list the factors of 6. And notice that you can also use 3 and 2. If they're both negative, they multiply to positive 6 and add to negative 5. So we want both of the numbers to be negative for this question. We keep the first term, and then we rewrite the middle using these numbers. Minus 2x minus 3x equal minus 5x, and then keep that plus 2. Now we can factor by grouping. The first two terms have x common. The last two terms, nothing is common. If it looks like nothing is common, then it must be 1. And because there's a minus sign here, I know I have a factor of negative 1. We see that 3x minus 2 is common, leaving x minus 1. Again, you can multiply those out to make sure they give you the trinomial we started with. At this point, you should be ready to try one on your own. Pause the video, see if you can do it. I'm not going to give explanations talking through the next bunch. I'm just going to write them down. You can watch as you need to. I should say, I said I wasn't going to talk. The number one mistake people make when they're factoring is that they don't write this down. They think they can do it in their heads, and then they make mistakes over and over again. This is the most common mistake I find. So if you're not getting these right, make sure you're writing down these steps. All right, two numbers that multiply to a times b, or a times c, I should say, and add to equal b. Two numbers that multiply to equal a times c and add to equal b. If you don't see the numbers right away, write out the factors. It always helps. This time I can use the 1 and the 6. I feel like I've made a mistake. Let me think about this a moment. Well, I found my mistake. I hope some of you saw it right away. This didn't work. -6 times 1 does not equal +6, although it does add to equal -5. Let's try again. I think I need to use the -2 and the -3. When I multiply them, it equals +6. When I add them, it equals -5. Did I mention that this is the place where most people make mistakes? All right, try again. -2x is common. -3 is common. -1 is common. Times 2x minus 3. Okay. Two numbers that multiply to equal A times C. Two numbers that add to equal B. I see I need to use 4 and 5. 4 needs to be negative. When I multiply, that gives me -20. When I add, that gives me +1. Rewriting the middle term. A times C and B. There's my 5. 8 needs to be negative so that it adds to -5. Two x plus 1 is common. And the last one here. They look very similar. 4 and 6 mixed up. Two numbers that multiply to A times C and add to equal B. It's going to be 8 and 3 again. But this time the 8 will be positive and the 3 will be negative. We're rewriting the middle term. 8x minus 3x equals 5x. Factor by grouping. -3 is common. Now we see that x plus 2 is common, leaving 4x minus 3. There is a lot of practice for factoring quadratic trinomials on the class Moodle page. I strongly suggest that you pause the video now, go take a look at that, and get some practice in. Now, let's talk about factoring completely. We did a little bit of this last week, and I said when you are asked to factor completely, we're always going to check for a greatest common factor. You won't always be reminded. So you should always check for a greatest common factor. It's possible that this exists. So if we look at the first example here, we see there's a greatest common factor of 3. Remember, that means we divide each term by 3. Divide each term by 3. Now in the brackets, we have a quadratic trinomial. So we have to think about those steps we were just using. A times C and B. Well, we know we're going to use 2 and 5, and the 2 needs to be negative. We can't leave out that factor of 3. So first thing we're going to do is write down the 3. And then inside the brackets, we're going to use these numbers that we just found. So we have x squared minus 2x plus 5x minus 10. So we rewrote this, changed the middle term using these numbers. Inside the brackets, we need to factor by grouping. but we can't leave behind that factor of 3. I have to have that extra set of brackets there because we have addition inside of our brackets. Now, we have the factor of 3. We see that x minus 2 is common, leaving x plus 5. I don't need any other brackets there. Why don't you pause your video and try completely factoring the next one. Do you see it has a greatest common factor of 5x? And now we need to factor the trinomial inside the brackets. Two numbers that multiply to equal 6 and add to equal -5. We should know this one by now. So we have 2x squared minus 3x minus 2x plus 3. But we still have that factor of 5x, and we can't leave it behind. We want to factor by grouping inside the brackets. And again, we have that factor of 5x. We don't want to leave it behind. Our final factoring is 5x times 2x minus 3 times x minus 1. Always check for a greatest common factor. When I looked at this one especially, I could see that it's not a quadratic trinomial. Quadratic trinomials have a factor, an exponent of x squared as the highest. That told me there was probably an x in every term. And in this example, the first one, a times c would have been -90. Not impossible, but you can see when we took out the factor of 3, it was much smaller and easier to work with. Before we look at the next type of factoring, let's review another binomial multiplication. Do you see what's different about this one from the last one we practiced? There's the variable y in the second term for each bracket. We have x times the second bracket plus 3y times the second bracket. You should pause your video and multiply that out. Notice that we ended up with a trinomial pretty similar to what we've been working with. The only difference is that we have y squared in the last term and xy in the middle term. These are factored in exactly the same way we've factored everything else. We find a times c, which in this case is 1 times -4, and we want b, -3. So we know we're going to use the numbers 1 and -4. They multiply to -4 and add to -3. We're going to rewrite the middle term, but this time instead of just x, we have xy. plus 1xy minus 4xy. So just the same thing, except now we have an x and a y together and a y squared. We can still factor by grouping. Negative 4y is common in the last two. Oops, negative 4y I said. Leaving x plus y here. We see that x plus y is common, leaving x minus 4y as the second factor. I'm going to stop here. I would suggest for your homework that you try questions 2, 3, and 4, and then we'll finish up this lecture in the next session.